Have you ever read a comic where the pacing is just right? Every single page just flows. It's easy to read. You can just keep flipping and flipping because you want to know more and more. Or what about when you're reading a webtoon and you're scrolling through? It's a really tense scene, and the next thing you know, you also feel that tension, that dread, that anticipation that something bad is about to happen. That's layout design. Today, in Panels in Progress, we're getting into one of the most powerful tools in comic storytelling, how you plan your comic pages. From thumbnails to page turns, from scroll flow to silent beats, we'll talk about all the things that make your layout support your story. Welcome to Panels in Progress. I'm Chris, and we're talking about the layout and thumbnailing. This is where your story gets its rhythm. It's not just about where the panels go, it's about how your reader feels as they move through each page. Whether you're working in a traditional format, you're printing a zine, or you're building a webtoon, the layout controls the tension. And the surprise hits, how the world is revealed, even character reveals. Let's talk about why this is so important and how to make it work for your style. So you might be asking, what is layouts? What's the purpose? What are thumbnails? And basically, layouts are the rough stage of your comic. It is the very next step, or it should be the very next step before you produce your comic. You're figuring out your page layouts, how your comic wants to look on each page, and how a double page spread looks together. Or you can even do the same thing for a webtoon, vertical scroll format, where you're spacing out the panels in such a way that as the reader scrolls through, they're hitting the panels at a particular rate. Your layouts, it is a major part of storytelling. It controls the pacing, whether you want a scene to be fast or slow. Usually you want your action scenes to be fast, or maybe your two characters are in an argument, so you want that back and forth dialogue to be snappy. Or maybe it's a horror comic or something, a thriller, where you're building up anticipation, and each little panel that you add slows the reader down as they are experiencing exactly what the character is experiencing. It also controls focus. What do you want your reader to look at? What do you want them to focus on? Is there something in a particular frame that needs to be overstated so that way they know that it's important? And it also controls impact, how dramatic a reveal feels. Think about your establishing shots. You're setting the scene for the comic, for the page. Think about your character reveals. Is it a surprise reveal? Or is it an intimidating reveal if it's the reveal of a villain? Think about yourself asking a question on one page and you know that you don't want them to get the answer until they flip the page. All of that is easily accomplished if you're doing layouts. Some examples of layouts done well. Think about Watchmen, an older comic, but a classic nonetheless. Uses a grid-based panel used to control time and focus. Attack on Titan uses full splash pages and angled panels to explode pacing during fights. Actually, a lot of action manga and action comics do this as well. Lore Olympus, vertical scroll format, mirrors emotional distance and tension between characters. So again, thumbnails are rough sketches, tiny versions of your pages that test layout, flow, and balance. Think of this as the storyboard phase of your comic. Don't worry about the details. Focus on your panel size, your order, your big story beats, and your moment-to-moment pacing. Also, something important to note in this phase while you're doing your rough sketches, make sure you're planning your speech bubbles, your words, your special effects in your thumbnails as well. Why? Because you don't want to run into putting this till later in your process of planning, because the worst thing that can happen is that you draw this amazing panel and you realize, oh wait, there was supposed to be some talking here, and now you have this bubble that is now covering up some of your awesome artwork. I've done this many times before where I've decided, oh, I will add the bubbles later. I'll worry about the speech later. Yes, I know they're supposed to talk in this, but when I didn't plan for those speech bubbles, every single time, because I work digitally, I would have to shrink down my artwork or completely redesign that panel to make the bubble fit, because you don't want to just cram your speech bubble in there. It's very important. So, a part of your thumbnailing session, make sure that your speech bubble is also being accounted for. Some quick tips: you can use post-it notes, small sketchbooks with little boxes, digital brushes that create thumbnail grid. You can do thumbnails digitally or traditionally. I prefer to do them traditionally and then I redo them all over again digitally, or sometimes I scan them in. But either way works, just as long as you're doing them. You can try multiple versions of a particular tricky page, and you can mark emotional beats and make sure that your page turns or your scrolling format works when you want it to work. That's the best way to figure out where your page turn is going to come, because you theoretically want your page turn to happen at a moment of anticipation. Like, let's say you're doing a horror comic and you have a monster reveal. You'd ideally want your person, your reader, to turn the page and then have the monster reveal on the next page instead of giving it all away on the first page. So the best way to plan for that is if you thumbnail. And sometimes your first thumbnail idea doesn't always work. You can always do multiple passes of thumbnails, try different angles of how to draw the characters, different positions, try different formats, or just try something completely out of the box. In the thumbnail format, this is where you want to experiment. This is where you want to play around and figure out what's going to work best to tell your story. And it'll also help you with your pacing to figure out, is this story flowing the way that I want it to? One thing to note when it comes to the page flow in print comics, like I was just saying earlier, is print comics are shaped by the page turn, what lands on the left versus right. You want the surprise reveal to happen when the reader flips it. You want to give your reader a desire to turn the page, a reason to keep going. You want to give your reader a reason to keep reading. I'm pretty sure you've read many comics or manga where literally you sit down, you only intend to read it for maybe 10-15 minutes, something like that, and you end up reading the whole entire manga because you can't stop turning the page. You want to just know more and more and more. Now also remember, depending on what you're creating, if you're creating a Western comic, then we naturally read left to right, top to bottom, but obviously on a manga, it's going to be the exact opposite, right to left, top to bottom. So just keep that in mind as you're laying out your pages. Just know exactly what's going to work best for your story. Some examples of great page turning comics to check out. Scott Pilgrim uses page turns to land jokes or dramatic moments, and Monstrous uses large, wide panels with grand reveals and tiny clustered ones for claustrophobic tension. Your best bet is to read your favorite comics and notice which ones you're consistently wanting to keep reading. Which ones that literally you can't stop reading. And don't stop at just, okay, yes, this comic was exciting and good. Ask yourself, what was working about the pages? What made you want to keep reading and keep going? For instance, some of my favorite ones that I could just endlessly read, I'll say them, I've said them 1,000 times, I'll probably end up saying them 1,000 times more. Witch Hat Atelier, Promise Neverland, Alice in Borderland, Something is Killing the Children, Philadelphia. I could go on and on. Gannibal, actually, that's a newer one. I could go on and on. Death Note, that very first arc of it, definitely a page turner. Could not stop reading that either. So yeah, always remember, you can always check your favorite comics and manga and decide how that page turn is going to work for you. How's it working for the professionals? It'll teach you how you can use it to your benefit. Let's switch gears a little bit, spend some time talking about webtoons. Vertical scroll is all about timing and space. You control how the reader waits before hitting the next image. This gives you cinematic pacing without words. Some people give webtoons a lot of slack, I guess, because they feel like the format isn't for them, but there's some great webtoons that do a lot of good things because you're controlling how fast they read or how slow they read. When you add those extra spaces between those panels, you can really slow things down, or when you put the panels really close together, you can speed them up because they're reading them that fast. You can also do these immersive, long establishing shots that literally start from above and they kind of just swirl and bring you down. It's like animation without being animated. The way, if you plot out the establishing shot well enough, you can really bring your reader into the world very easily. And another cool thing about webtoons is how you can transition so smoothly from one scene to a next with a transition. You can create your own rules when it comes to page flips. Because there is an endless scroll, you get to decide if 3 panels is a page or is 6 panels a page, or what section is, how one section flows into another. You have a lot of freedom with that, so don't be afraid to just experiment and give it a try. Again, read some webtoons, read some tapas comics, and find out what are they using and what's working for them, and how could you possibly use it in your own story. And this is kind of just the quick takeaways. You can use white space to slow pacing or build tension, stack tall panels for action or descent, save emotional moments for isolated centerpieces. Another cool thing about webtoons is the bubbles. In webtoon, you don't have to force your bubble inside the frame. You can keep your bubbles above the frames and reserve all of your panel for the artwork. That is one very cool thing about webtoons. Designing for emotion. Layouts supports emotional storytelling. Think about how tight panels can create tension or anxiety, how wide panels can show space, peace, freedom, or distance, how panel shape and arrangement can reinforce what your characters are feeling. Always experiment with a panel for your page, and if one panel shape isn't working, try another. Try no panels. How does it feel to have a page that is borderless? How does it feel to have a couple frames that the shape changes, as long as the story dictates that? You never want to just have random designs, but if your story is doing something unique with its paneling, you might enhance the reader experience. Some quick tips: diagonal panels are usually used for action or chaos. Rounded panels can be dreamlike or a soft emotion, and tight square panels can mean confinement or frustration. And speaking of paneling, I did want to tell one story about how I was reading a comic. I'm not going to say the name of the comic because this comic is pretty popular, but if you guess what comic it is, let me know in the comment section below. But regardless, I'm not trying to be hard or illogical, but I read 2 comics that did something very similar, and one comic, it was 2 stories being told at the same time, and you had to flip the book upside down to read the comic one way and then flip it the other way to read it the other way. But it was a cool idea. I got what they were trying to do, even though it was like 2 dimensions happening at the same time. However, because the comic became so disorienting when I had to keep turning the book one way, turning the book the other way. I wasn't sure which way I should really be reading it, and I kept getting lost and confused about what story I was following, and I was constantly reading the wrong panels. And to me, I would say that panel flow did not work for me, and it completely took me out of the story. I was already struggling to read it as it was because it took a while to like get to the interesting part, but having to do all this extra work to try and figure out how to read the comic completely ruined the experience for me, and I DNF'd, which is I did not finish that comic, and that's quite sad. So I say that to say, make sure that if you're doing some interesting things with your comic, make sure you give it to people to read and check out, and make sure that they can actually follow it without getting a headache. Don't give your reason. Like, there's so many comics, manga, so many stories, there's so many distractions out in the world already. Don't give your readers a reason to stop reading your story. You want to give them all the reasons they need to continue to read your story. You want them to become fans. You want them to become lovers of what you're sharing with them. So don't give them a reason to just stop. On the other hand, I had another comic that was well done that I feel it did something very similar. It was all one story, but it literally had you, like, the main character was having some problems facing reality, and they weren't sure if their memories were real memories or if they were hallucinations. So as they kind of delved into this world trying to uncover what had happened to them in their past, they were kind of diving into the madness of what had happened, and the artist had you like follow the character in a disorienting way, but the way he set up the speech bubbles and the way he set up the orientation of the book, you didn't lose where you were supposed to read next. I was never confused about, oh, this panel, should I go to this top right panel or should I jump straight to the bottom? Like, I was never confused, even though he was using full page spreads without actual panels. That story was actually very enjoyable because even though I felt the madness of trying to keep up with what the character was doing, I still never lost the story, and it still made me want to keep going forward. So just remember, you can obviously do whatever you want. You can be expressive as you want, but just be careful with your structure and how the reader is going to read this, because if they can't read it, they won't. Layout is where your comic becomes readable. Its rhythm, its impact, and its feeling. A well-structured layout can land a joke, break a heart, or make someone gasp on the page turn. So spend time here. Spend as much time as you need getting your layouts together. Play with the flow. Test your scenes, and don't be afraid to thumbnail a page 10 or more times until it feels right. This step is where your story really starts to come to life. This is actually one of my favorite parts of making comics, is the layouts. Because in the layouts, this is where you are taking literal words on a page, your basic ideas, and you are really starting to solidify it as a real book. Enjoy this phase, and hopefully if you do it right, this is the first building block to make the rest of you making your comic a little bit easier. So be honest, do you thumbnail or create layouts right before you start drawing, or do you just jump into the drawing and hope for the best? Let me know what team you're on in the comments section, and until next time, get those panels in progress.